I'm Karen Engel, and I teach at the law school at the University of Texas. And along with Professor Neville Hode, co-direct the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. It is my pleasure to welcome those of you who have joined us from near and far to the third lecture in our fall 2020 colloquium, Inequality, Labor, and Human Rights, the Future of Work in the Age of Pandemic. Professor Adelle Blackett from McGill Law School will present her talk entitled Racial Capitalism's Challenge to International Labor Law, Addressing Prison Labor in the United States. And Badur Alagra from African and African Diaspora Studies here at UT will respond. As many of you know, the Rappaport Center hosts a colloquium every fall on human rights and inequality. This year's colloquium is also part of the buildup for a new interdisciplinary and cross-campus initiative on the future of work that is generously supported by the Office of the Vice President for Research at UT. We will be holding a pop-up institute late next spring, currently entitled Beyond the Future of Work, New Paradigms for Addressing Global Inequality, and are using this colloquium to begin to think in earnest together about these issues. The colloquium is also part of an interdisciplinary seminar that we teach at the law school. This year, I'm teaching it with Rappaport Center postdoctoral fellow, Michal Khan, who is an historian of labor sociology. 12 of the participants in the virtual room are also in the seminar. And in preparation for Professor Blackett's talk today, we read some of her work alongside work on racial capitalism by folks like Cedric Robinson and Walter Johnson. And so we're really delighted to engage in this conversation with her today. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank our Assistant Director, Sarah Eliason, who is the Rappaport Center logo right now, for all her work on coordinating, and there she is, and promoting the event. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Adelle Blackett, who is Professor of Law and Canada Research Chair in Transnational Labor Law and Development at McGill University. She's also Director of the Labor Law and Development Research Laboratory, working on cutting-edge questions around labor law from the perspective of the Global South. A former official at the International Labor Office in Geneva, Professor Blackett has been actively involved with the ILO as an expert on international standard setting on decent work for domestic workers, leading to the adoption of ILO Convention number 189 and recommendation number 201. And she continues to work with the ILO quite a bit, as you'll hear today. She's published widely in English, French, and Spanish in the field of transnational labor law. She's author of a terrific book, which I have here as a show and tell, Everyday Transgressions, Domestic Workers' Transnational Challenge to International Labor Law, that came out with Cornell University Press in 2019. She's also co-editor of a research handbook on transnational labor law. Adelle has received many prestigious research grants and awards, and she won't get to speak if I go through them all. So I'll just mention the one that popped out at me, which was she received in 2012 a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. So after we hear from Adelle Blackett, Badur Alagra will provide some comments as a respondent. Badur Alagra is Assistant Professor of Political and Social Thought in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies here at UT Austin. She works on Caribbean political thought, African anti-colonial thought, and Black Marxisms. She has a book manuscript entitled The Interminable Catastrophe, Fatal Liberalisms, Plantation Logics, and Black Political Life in the Wake of Disaster. So I hope you all have a sense already of why we asked her to respond to Adelle Blackett's piece. Badur also has a terrific article on racial capitalism that has helped us a lot in this project. And so anyway, we're really delighted that she could join us today. And you have their full bios in the materials and the announcement for the talk and the attachments. or the links. But I will mention something I just noticed when I was looking at those bios again, which is that, so you probably guessed that Adele is from Canada, but Baddour is as well. So we could say well, let's be in Quebec. We can be in Quebec today, some of us. At least Adele's there. So thank you very much for joining us in this virtual space, and we look forward to a great discussion. Take it away, Adele.
Great. Good afternoon, and thank you very much to professors and Rappaport co-directors Karen Engel and Neville Hode. Thank you, Karen, for the lovely introduction. Thank you also to Dr. Michelle Khan for the invitation, and to Sarah Eliasson, who provided much appreciated support for this workshop. And thanks also to the three class participants, Marta Asherio, Marissa Elder, and Nathan Simmons, who wrote thoughtful comments on a forthcoming speech in the Dalhousie Law Journal. And finally, thanks in advance to my co-transnational Canadian Baddour Allegra for her engagement with this presentation. And I very much look forward to your thoughts on the article that I'll present, which is forthcoming with Alice Duquesnoy, who is a former exchange student who participated in a course that I held in 2019 called The Transnational Futures of International Labor Law. And it was in commemoration of the ILO's centenary. And that piece, the piece that I'll be presenting, is in the UCLA Law Review. And I believe Alice is with us via YouTube Live, despite the fact that she's in Paris and it's now probably 11 p.m. there. So all the best, and delighted to have you here as well. So I've been asked to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. And let me first mention, since we have decided that we are in Quebec, which is on the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, let me express that how I've spent much of today, reserved for preparing, I've spent much of the day feeling somewhat distracted because colleagues here circulated a letter protesting the disciplining of a professor for using the N-word in class. Making matters worse, they referred to the professor as having faced a public lynching. So I'm one of only 2 Black women teaching law in tenured or tenure-track positions in the entire province of Quebec, the other having just started this September. And I was reminded by the cavalier manner in which the history and afterlives of anti-Black racism, to invoke Saidiya Hartman, are consistently ignored, even following the summer of reckoning that so many of us and so many claimed to have awakened their sensibilities. So in the wake of the murderous acts faced by George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a long line of African Americans, and yes, African Canadians and Indigenous peoples on their own lands. So I responded on Twitter, and there have been some important developments, but one of the authors of the initial letter actually wrote to me to state, and I kid you not, and this is why I'm referencing it, that in referencing lynching, they were not seeking to invoke, quote, an historical metaphor. Yes, timely. The work I'm sharing with you is entitled Slavery is Not a Metaphor. And let me talk about the direction that this work has taken me in charging international labor lawyers with the responsibility to deal with the history and living presence of the Black Atlantic by naming slavery is not a metaphor. I've been deeply concerned to call attention to the implications of the centuries-long transatlantic slave trade and the literature that has mostly been ignored in the fast and furious international law invocations of modern slavery, particularly involving various forms of labor exploitation along global value chains and global care chains. So the memory that has tended to be perpetuated and that is witnessed in the reemergence of the discourse on trafficking recalls a Wilberforcian vision of ending the slave trade and combating its perpetuation on the high seas. Jenny Martinez's important work chronicles this and refers to it as part of the origins of the human rights movement. But there is a palpable lack of willingness to engage with the centuries-long reality of slavery and its fundamental implications on institutions and the ways of understanding freedom and unfreedom, including our legally received understanding of liberalism. So the article that I will present calls for a recalibration. It builds on other work that I've done on racial capitalism and its very presence in our understanding of our field. It argues that transnational labor law is deeply historicized, rooted in the persisting presence of a racial capitalism that is too easily relegated to a distant past. It addresses mass incarceration and prison labor in the United States, both as it relates to the development of international treaties on slavery and forced labor, and as it has been monitored by the International Labor Organization's supervisory body, the Committee of Experts on the Application of Labor Standards. The ILO-US dialogue, as I'll refer to it, on racial disparities in forced labor in prisons offers, frankly, a rare instance in which the distinctly intertwined histories and the persistence of racial capitalism through prisons are engaged. The dialogue supports the act of historical memory that operates in the work of those who understand mass incarceration and prison labor as part and parcel of the persistent afterlives of slavery. The papers on this theme that I've written are larger. They're part of a larger book-length project, and they have, for me, entailed significant archival work at the ILO and at the UN archives for the League of Nations. Some of the insights have been wonderfully startling reminders, as all three paper reactors picked up, of the ways in which a range of actors, including leading Pan-Africanists like W.E.B. Du Bois and Haitian diplomat Dantes Bellegarde, engaged emerging institutions with a call for them to build a thicker understanding of slavery and to address the question of racialization. It is also linked to a general rapporteurship that I've just accepted with the International Academy of Comparative Law, through which I expect to foster a dialogue about transatlantic slavery and contemporary legal framings of slavery. But allow me a bit more framing of today's paper. So first, W.E.B. Du Bois, who I've just invoked, the first African-American to earn a PhD at Harvard and who studied in Germany under Max Weber, but whose rightful place as the father of US sociology was largely overlooked. Du Bois interacted with both the League of Nations and the ILO, and generations of African-American leaders following him have understood the central need to take their struggles to the international stage. Carol Anderson's pivotal scholarship has turned close, careful attention to the challenges that characterized African-American struggle for a thick notion of human rights, and that opposed to a threadbare notion of civil rights through precisely the internationalism at the United Nations. And similarly, leaders of the NAACP understood the perils of focusing the civil rights challenge on discrimination in restaurants and theaters without attacking problems of employment and the like, which affect the lives and destinies of persons who are not able to go into these establishments. But the early strategic decisions at the height of the Cold War and McCarthyism led away from, rather than toward, closer engagement with labor rights, despite active US involvement in the ILO, and this before it joined the organization in 1934. So Anderson's work focused on the post-Second World War period does not contain a single indexing reference to the ILO. And so my work, this article, is part of the complementary research on decolonizing labor law that seeks to bring the ILO and alternative visions provided by Pan-Africanist and decolonial scholars to the ILO more fully into view. Now a little more about the ILO. And the article focuses on a discrete and little noticed dimension of the US's engagement with the ILO's vast normative universe of 190 ratifiable international labor conventions, 6 ratifiable protocols to existing international labor conventions, and 207 non-binding international labor recommendations. The US has yet to ratify 6 of the 8 conventions considered to be fundamental by the ILO. Notably the ILO's main treaties dealing with racial and other forms of discrimination. But the United States 1991 ratification of the Abolition of Forced Labor Convention from 1957, and which I'll refer to as Convention number 105, provided a little noticed opportunity for the ILO's Committee of Experts on the Application of Labor Standards, which I'll refer to as the Committee of Experts, to address a condition that historians have understood both as a legacy through interpretations of the 13th Amendment and as a perpetuation, prison labor. So it's through this lens of the US ratification of Convention 105 that the ILO's supervisory bodies have developed an important and little commented upon jurisprudence on slavery and race in prison labor. So little's been written about the development in the ILO framework. The ILO's first Director General, Albert Thomas, petitioned delegations of the League of Nations in an unsuccessful bid to claim the ILO's constitutional competence to address slavery. For Thomas, slavery could be considered nothing other than conditions of work. And instead, an ILO representative was appointed to the ILO to what was then its mandate section of the League of Nations, and it had been entrusted with studying slavery. The mandate section draft included references to forced labor that amply legitimized it for public purposes. The matter of forced labor, therefore, was referred to the ILO in keeping with the ILO's constitutional responsibility to set standards on conditions of labor. But ultimately, this has led it to police the public-private demarcation. Its chair, Lord Lugar, was understood both by Grimshaw and by Columbia University professor of public law, Joseph Chamberlain, the US member of the ILO's Committee of Experts on so-called native labor that assumed responsibility for the standard setting for years before the US joined the organization, as considering forced labor to be, quote, necessary for local public purposes. So the colonial roots of the standard setting at the ILO are unmistakable. The ILO entangled itself in a fraught process of building that native labor code, which incidentally in the archives is often referred to as a colored labor code. This was essentially shaped by colonial administrators, and it permeates the forced labor instrument. Neither the international labor definition of slavery nor the international legal definition of forced labor show any rootedness in the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade and its racialized unfreedom. So in light of this history, it's not surprising that the first forced labor convention, Convention number 29, has been interpreted by the ILO's supervisory body in a manner that imposes strict conditions on prison labor in private prisons, but leaves prison labor in public prisons largely untouched, as some of my colleagues have been boring down on in their own research. Faina Millman-Sivan and her colleague, Professor Sagi. Although the United States never joined the League of Nations, it played a unique role in shaping the development of both instruments. The US ratified the Slavery Convention in 1926, subject to a double negative reservation that echoes the 13th Amendment, but is different from the 13th Amendment in its specific reference to opposition to forced or contemporary labor, and then the familiar language except as punishment for crime of which the person concerned has been duly convicted. And it takes exception with the suggestion that compulsory or forced labor may only be exacted for, surprise, public purposes. The US has never ratified Convention 29, nor has it ratified the 2014 protocol to the convention that repeals the transitional provisions includes a specific reference to trafficking in persons and includes capacious insistence on the need to identify the root causes of forced labor. The US did, however, ratify the Abolition of Forced Labor Convention, which is a post-war instrument adopted, as I mentioned earlier, in 1957. And it emerged alongside the UN's 1956 Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the slave trade, and institutions and practices similar to slavery. As I have also mentioned, the US ratified belatedly in 1991, and in the forthcoming paper, discuss the process leading to that ratification. But I will only mention now that there were indicia that the US did not expect that it was going to be regulated on its penal labor practices in the context of Convention 105, despite, frankly, earlier supervisory bodies having been quite critical about practices of segregation associated with penalties that amounted to forced labor. Convention 105 contains, for our purposes, in its first article, an enumeration of practices that are to be prohibited, including forced labor used as a means of, quote, racial, social, national, or religious discrimination, end of quote. So the ILO's Committee of Experts, which comprises eminent jurists from around the world and has a mandate to examine reports submitted by governments on ratified conventions pursuant to the ILO Constitution. Since the early 2000s, it has turned to the US for answers via the very particular devices that it deploys: direct requests, observations, requests for information on issues of mass incarceration and the disproportionate impact on African Americans incarcerated and working in prisons. The Committee of Experts starts its inquiry carefully with the request for statistical information and some increasingly pointed questions, and then it moves to particular reports by the US Sentencing Commission. And it's particularly unmoved when the US government replies that US law and policy clearly prohibits racial discrimination in criminal justice systems. It becomes, the Committee of Experts, that is, more direct in its requests, asking for more data, more information, including about the status of legislation. And for those who watch the ILO processes closely, the language or tone may appear understated in normal conversations, but given the magnitude, especially of the disparities that are exposed, but the Committee of Experts increasingly names the existence, indeed the persistence of discrimination, and increasingly calls for the US government to determine the extent of the discrimination. And then it happens. We get a turn, and it's quite a deliberate turn by the US government to invoking trafficking. So no sooner than the Committee of Experts raises the issues of race in the direct requests, the US government turns attention to issues of trafficking, invoking legislation that had recently been adopted. And the turn, of course, then shifts the focus quite immediately. Rather than finding itself on the defensive, the US government is able, through the invocation of trafficking, to hold out a way through which it is acting in a positive role. It is acting to prevent forced labor, and it highlights its criminal law enforcement powers. It's held out the promise then of refocusing the discussion, of introducing data sets that had nothing to do with prisons and mass incarceration at all, and in the process, an opportunity to refocus the focus of forced labor. So the trafficking focus brings forth that valiant role of the state as the actor central to combating a global problem, rather than the state as the actor that is perpetuating the problem of forced labor, perpetuating racial capitalism. The approach, in other words, brought it back to the role it anticipated that it might play in the world on ratification of Convention number 105 that of moral leader in the eradication of problem that it perceived to be prevalent mostly elsewhere, but certainly also a role in which the state itself was less the problem than the solution. So one reads through the lines that the committee of experts was looking for more, indeed, for something different. But the committee of expert does bite the bait, as it were. It asks for more details. It seeks to find out just how proactive the US government really is or has been on redressing trafficking. It concentrates on the number of anti-trafficking task forces and how they may have increased. Starting in 2007, the committee does address trafficking in depth in its application of the standard setting. The 2014 Protocol to Convention number 29, which I referenced at the outset, contains a specific reference to trafficking. And so it falls in fertile territory. And of course, that inclusion was actively sought by the US government. Fertile territory for the ILO's detailed attention to the US's government's decision to maximize its ability to enforce laws on the trafficking in persons. However, trafficking discourse did not simply replace the focus on racial disparities and mass incarceration. In fact, in the ILO's Committee of Experts 2018 direct request, the focus on racially discriminatory distinctions on the exaction of compulsory labor was actually one of the first matters addressed, and it did engage. So while the introduction of the trafficking discourse by the US seems to have replaced the government's focus, the ILO's approach remained different. By the time the 2009 direct request came forward, racial discrimination in the exaction of prison labor actually became, once again, the exclusive focus of the Committee of Experts' comments. So the Committee of Experts reaffirmed its jurisdiction over significant racial disparities in the US criminal justice system. Moreover, where the punishment involved compulsory labor, which does not come under one of the sections of the first article of Convention 105 that I mentioned, but punishment is meted out more severely to members of racialized communities, the situation falls within the scope of Convention 105, and the committee has insisted on responding. So now you might ask, what has come of this dialogue between the US and the ILO? And at some level, this is why I'm presenting this paper. Part of writing the paper is to ask who is paying attention to this dialogue beyond the government and beyond the ILO Committee of Experts. I still meet colleagues who are specialists in the field who have little idea about US ratification, much less about the exchanges that have been ongoing for decades. And that have intensified, certainly were intensified under the Obama administration with the last direct request in 2013, but with concerns about racial disparities signaled as concerns sentencing as recently in 2017. So the importance persists, the pressure continues, and yet what happens to international lawmaking, to international action, to attempts to shine a spotlight when we, academics or movements for social justice, stop paying attention? Consider that the ILO, whose statements of racial non-discrimination principles in its 1944 Declaration of Philadelphia predates the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, issued a centenary declaration last year that makes no mention of racial discrimination, despite the fact that the Committee of Experts took the time to issue an important general observation on racial discrimination, underscoring the contemporary climate and the dangers of particular forms of resurgent populist, dare I say fascist governance. Institutions like the Committee of Experts face backlash. They face criticism precisely because they've taken strong, consistent, authoritative positions on fundamental conventions, fundamental principles and rights and work. So part of the question, is this making a difference, is of course, are we paying attention? Are we drawing on those moments where international actors show the courage to raise deeply controversial questions, deeply important questions, when they hold open, however narrowly, spaces to engage with the ongoing character of racial capitalism and call for answers. And for those who may wonder about the ability of social movements to gain access to the supervisory bodies and to seek actions in pivotal moments like the current COVID-19 pandemic that is disproportionately affecting African Americans by virtue of the work they do, as well as other racialized, historically disadvantaged communities, notably migrant workers. Consider the recent AFL-CIO, alongside the Service Employee International Union, SUI, recently submitted, so October 7th, a powerful 51-page complaint to the ILO, to another of its supervisory bodies, the ILO's Committee on Freedom of Association, in which it alleges, or they allege, that the laws, policies, and practices of the US government violate the fundamental rights to freedom of association, to organize, and to bargain collectively, with a particular focus on the suffering and death of workers during the COVID-19 pandemic, and with a particular spotlight on certain industries where essential workers are ordered to keep working. Framing around exclusions from freedom of association, failure to protect against anti-union discrimination, interference in constriction and denial of collective bargaining rights, the complaint basically underscores the extent to which being labeled essential workers, a label applied disproportionately to racialized communities, has meant not greater respect, not greater concern, and certainly not greater protection for the work undertaken and the safety, life, well-being of these workers, but rather greater compulsion to work, to serve others. So it's hard to make too fine a point of this historical continuity. It's hard not to recall the insights of the persistence of racial capitalism, or in Stuart Hall's terms, of capitalism advancing precisely on divided terrain. So to conclude, my work operates an act of historical memory. It seeks to offer a reminder to us that by suggesting that in the focus on racialization, in its engagement with forced labor, the ILO moves the understanding back to the direction urged almost a century ago by those committed to a vision, excuse me, a vision of native labor that was not colonial, but rather that was focused on redressing the challenges of the color line. The ILO US dialogue on racial disparities in forced labor in prisons is a rare instance in which the distinctly intertwined histories of slavery, racial capitalism on the one hand, and prison labor are engaged because of the risk of enabling the transgressive potential of that history to be eclipsed by focused on so-called modern slavery or trafficking. There's a need to focus attention on the persistence of the past in the present. They affect the racialization of ongoing practices of subordination, including in contemporary trafficking, and who is actually being criminalized through the deployment of this lens. And there again, some of the work underscoring the disproportionate representation of African Americans in those newly criminalized through the procedures gives room for pause. These developments are transnational. And I noted in the comments by the readers of my paper, the struggling with the transnational, struggling, I think that many of us share, with moving beyond a methodological nationalism that leads us to see the phenomena that are replicated in practices of policing modern slavery in many parts of the world. The practice of disconnecting modern slavery from what is a global history of slavery. Right? Particularized experiences in places like the United States and in places like Canada that are often thought of as being the recipients of enslaved persons seeking freedom, but rarely recognized to have incarnated its own history of slavery, and more so, like so many places, having its economy deeply entangled in the slave trade, which was also about the movement of commodities other than the bodies of African enslaved persons, the movement of commodities that fueled the slave trade, the movement of the commodities that were made by enslaved persons. And of course, as Eric Williams underscores, the extent to which the capital that derived from the centuries-long global institution enabled modern capitalism to emerge. So we need to think the transnational in historical terms. Think the transnational in ways that connect it with longer stories of unfreedom. Rethink disciplines like labor law that connect it to this longer history, that resist tellings of its origin, that narrow it to one vision of where mobilization emerged and fueled the development. So with the risk of enabling a transgressive potential of this history, there's a need to focus more closely on the persistence of the past in the present, a need to think these developments transnationally, to historicize the transnational, rather than enable a shift in gears. To focus on the legacies of the past allows any subsequent or simultaneous analysis of contemporary forms of slavery to proceed, at the very least, without reconstituting the errors of the past, with due vigilance and care, operating an alternative and, dare I say, emancipatory discourse. The transnational requires, therefore, critical decolonial interrogations for transnational labor laws' counter-hegemonic potential to be recentered. So I'll stop there and look forward to the comments.
Great. Thank you so much. Professor Alagra.
Yes. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Perfect. So first, I'd like to thank the Rappaport Center for inviting me to respond to this really quite fascinating paper offered by Dr. Blackett. I'll begin my remarks with a very firm caveat that I am not a legal scholar. And as such, I will leave Dr. Blackett to respond to certain questions concerning the histories and technicalities of this particular legal framework being offered here. Instead, I'd like to take some time to respond to the manner in which Professor Blackett takes up racial capitalism in her really adroit analysis of the discursive and legal gymnastics engaged in on the part of the United States in their efforts to legitimize the contradictions embedded in the 13th Amendment and subsequently act as a policing power as far as forced labor is concerned, all while disavowing the manner in which forced labor, from slavery to the present in the form of prison labor, makes up the very bedrock upon which America's legal and labor schema renders itself sensical and coherent in the first place. When reading this piece, I was struck by the title and the opening phrase, "Slavery is not a metaphor." Indeed, as academics, we're caught in and ethically implicated in the reproduction of a peculiar double bind, that abstraction and metaphor are both a form of violence, and yet analogy is also a violence. So how do we go about the work of studying things clearly, properly? How do we go about studying things at all? This brings me to Dr. Blackett's invocation of racial capitalism, a term which has many different intellectual genealogies, yet in the definition offered by Cedric Robinson offers us a way out of this aporia of studying things properly, like labor, slavery, etc., by looking to the historical mechanics that give us both the ruptures and continuities that undergird our current systems of thinking. In his tome, Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson offers the following meditation on the meaning and nature of this thing that is so contested as a term today, racial capitalism. He writes, quote, "The development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions. So too did social ideology. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. I have used the term racial capitalism to refer to this development and to the subsequent structure as a historical agency," end quote. Fundamental to Robinson's intervention is his suggestion that feudalism was not overturned or destroyed by the historical or material rupture presented by capitalism, but rather it was merely extended along new categories of difference, growing in fits and starts, to quote from Robin Kelly. This lends itself particularly well to consider how US labor laws concerning forced labor did not in fact break with its foundational system of racial slavery, but merely extended it along new lines, in similar fits and starts depending on the political circumstances and moment. This is a compelling argument because it doesn't rely on the particular definition of racial slavery to make it compelling, but rather it relies on the one thing about Robinson's text that remains singular in my estimation, the methodology, the manner of building and scaffolding an argument along the lines of historical circumstances. Professor Blackett's weaving of legal scholarship and Black studies theoretical vision is equally compelling. For example, when she invokes W.E.B. Du Bois' 1903 Declaration from the Souls of Black Folks, in which he states that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Du Bois introduced the term much earlier during a lecture given at the third annual meeting of the American Negro Academy in 1900 titled, quote, "The Present Outlook for the Dark Races of Mankind," end quote. During this speech, he states that, quote, "the problem of the color line, not simply as a national and personal question, but rather in its larger world aspect in time and space," end quote. For Du Bois, the color line belts the world. And the American problem of the color line is precisely that, a problem, which requires constant border policing, reification, rearticulation. We come to understand through Du Bois's work that the experience of being Black is intimately tied to the law. It is not just a matter of skin color, but rather for Du Bois, being Black means riding Jim Crow car. Equally important is the relationship between labor and the law, as it were. Equally important in the relationship between labor and the law, as it were, to be Black is to also be refused the benefits of your surplus labor via plantation slavery, and equally via wage theft and other forms of coerced work, which are authorized by the law. The law is, in this way, a mechanism by which the narrative condemnation of Black life is authorized, routinized, and formalized. I'm also reminded of Du Bois' critique of prisons offered in Souls, which he equally saw, again, as an extension of this old order along new axes, making up an important component of his critique of what Saidiya Hartman calls the non-event of emancipation, or what Martin Luther King Jr. called the freedom to starve. This really singular critique of prisons, as written by Du Bois in Souls, reads as follows, quote, and this is from his chapter on the Black Belt, quote, then came the Black slaves. Day after day, the clank of chained feet marching from Virginia and Carolina to Georgia was heard in these rich swamplands. 150 barons commanded the labor of nearly 6,000 Negroes, held sway over farms with 90,000 acres of 20,000 bales of gin cotton, which went nearly to England, new and old. Negro convicts and Black convicts then were even more plentiful than now. It was a way of making Negroes work, end quote. Indeed, we see the methodological insights offered by Robinson, who himself draws on Du Bois' work, come into sharp focus here, to see the way that capitalism simply re-territorializes older forms of domination as it expands and grows. And here is the hinge point that connects slavery to forced prison labor. So the laws that keep this fatal merry-go-round going. The hinge point is the compulsion to work above all else. Another point I found fascinating is the distinction between native labor and other forms of labor as offered by Lord Lugard, who, as we know, was the architect of the indirect rule model of colonial domination. In response to this conception of native labor, I offer another reading by Sylvia Wynter, who identifies America as a space made up of only settlers and natives, insofar as formerly enslaved Africans become conscripted into native labor in relation to their former masters after emancipation. The devaluation of the labor power of Black people was carried out via an exchange in which slavery was only the first form and mechanism of devaluation, going with the insistence that old mechanisms are merely reinscribed rather than broken. Wynter inverts Marx's base superstructural model, suggesting that the base of American capitalism is in fact the discursive and narrative devaluation of Black life, and the superstructure is in fact the plantation system. Segregation in the United States, and to this I would add prisons, according to Wynter, was fundamental in the transformation of the Negro into the new native, which function of which, according to Wynter, was the transformation of the Negro into a native labor force, right? This is premised on what she calls a pieza valuation under slavery, right? The enslaved was not labor, nor were they the antithesis to labor, but rather they were a piece of labor, and premised on a relative devaluation of native labor after emancipation. Since America is a settler society above all else, for Wynter, the distinction between settler and native categories is premised on the mode of labor extraction. In this manner, the Negro becomes transformed into a native alongside, not instead of, indigenous Americans in relation to the waged labor of white settlers. The enslaved Negro was a commodity and a pieza. The transformed native was that of devalued labor in relation to white settler labor after the moment of emancipation. This is something that I find is compelling in relation to the manner in which the creation of the category of native labor was meant precisely to allow coerced labor to remain uninterrupted while providing the discursive veil to make such a legal move legitimate. We learn from Wynter, and indeed through this paper, that wage labor rests upon an invisibilized bedrock composed of racial slavery. Indeed, this invisibilized presence is the primary mechanism through which wage labor renders itself meaningful. To put it plainly, wherever there is wage labor, it sits atop 500 years of racial slavery, invisibilized but still fundamental to the order. In the same way that enslaved labor rendered wage labor cohesive conceptually during slavery, so too, as Professor Blackett demonstrates, does America's Cold War propaganda concerning gulag labor versus free labor, right? We know from the work of people like Ruthie Gilmore, right? That the concealed nucleus of America's disavowal of the Gulag system was the preservation of its own Gulag extraction of surplus labor from the new and old natives of this new world. This brings me to the question of modern forms of slavery as presented in these legal frameworks, and the manner in which this is an unstable ground upon which to launch new understandings of forced labor. As we know, the plantation itself is what gave us modernity as we know it. C.L.R. James argues in The Black Jacobins that Black people living on plantations were the first people to live truly modern lives, due in part to the manner in which they worked and labored. He writes the following, quote, "The sugar plantation has been the most civilizing as well as the most demoralizing influence in West Indian development. When 3 centuries ago, the slaves came to the West Indies, they entered directly into large-scale agriculture of the sugar plantation, which was a modern system. It further required that the slaves live together in a social relation, far closer than any proletariat of the time. The cane, when reaped, had to be rapidly transported to what was factory production. The product was shipped abroad for sale. Even the cloth the slaves wore and the food they ate was imported. The Negroes, therefore, from the very start, lived a life that was in essence a modern life. That is their history, as far as I've been able to discover, a unique history," end quote. What does it mean to use slavery as the silent other in relation to which legal codes define modern versus non-modern forms of forced labor, knowing as we do now that slavery was the first appearance of modernity? This contradiction is, of course, produced by the disavowal of racial slavery, even as it remains central to rendering these legal orders coherent. We see this disavowal, of course, in Professor Blackett's assertion that the discourse concerning human trafficking is used to further veil the contradictions of forced labor. We know that what needs to be upheld is not the sanctity of work, but rather what needs to be upheld is the disavowal of racial slavery upon which our conceptualization of work rests. Without this disavowal, the center cannot and will not hold. In this way, we might see this disavowal of slavery as a nomos unto itself, given its importance in structuring the written law via this absented presence, and given that it accounts for all the discursive excess of the written law upon which the law rests, as Carl Schmitt tells us, right? Professor Blackett's piece ends in just the right place, in my estimation, via the insistence of the persistence of the past in the present, right? I'm reminded of Michel Rothschild's insistence that, quote, "the past is a position." In writing about the disappearance of the radical figure of Sans Souci, he writes that, quote, "Henri Christophe killed Sans Souci twice. First, literally during their last meeting. Second, symbolically by naming his most famous palace, Sans Souci, which erased Sans Souci from Christophe's own past and it erased him from his future," end quote. Here we see the manner in which the language of forced labor is used to erase the highest articulation of forced labor, racial slavery, from its own past and its own future. That the disappearing act is not in refusing to name forced labor, but by naming it in such a way that is so narrow that it is rendered, to put it crudely, not useful for our study of this country's history. Indeed, we can hide slavery in plain sight in that way. So some things that came up as I was reading are some questions that tend to come up in general as I think about, slavery. And the question that kind of haunts me and haunts Black studies, haunts this kind of legal framework, of course, is slavery a labor problem or is it something else, right? And so my understanding, of course, is that it is something else, though of course it is related to the predicament of labor. But this is what I would like to discuss. It reveals an age-old dilemma in the study of slavery, of course. The question of whether or not enslaved Africans were laborers or workers or something else. What we do know is that enslaved Africans worked, of course, but were also commodities bought and sold for profit. The categories of labor, commodity, etc. offered to us unravel, are thrown into crisis, which is why the question comes up again and again. This comes up in the many criticisms that many people have of W.E.B. Du Bois' argument in Black Reconstruction, in which he refers to enslaved Africans as part of the dark proletariat of the world, and refers to their joining of the Union Army and fleeing plantations as, quote, "not merely a desire to stop work, but a general strike against the conditions of work," end quote. Now, those people who know me personally know that I am a propagandist of this text, Black Reconstruction. I think this argument is beautiful, but it returns us to the question of whether we need to continue to stretch the category of worker legally and discursively to include enslaved Africans, or whether we need to pivot to another grammar altogether, right? These other grammars include, the idea of the property in person, which Anthony Bogues invokes in Black Heretics, Black Prophets, Winter's idea of the pieza labor, so not quite labor, not quite worker. This is a problem that has taken up decades, and the breadth of this long 20th century of scholarship concerning slavery and capitalism, including but not limited to, of course, Eric Williams, C.L.R. James, W.B. Du Bois, and others. And then another question that I have is, what is the relationship between debt, money, prisons, and forced work and forced labor? Debt itself, many people who are familiar with, Lenin's critique of finance capitalism, right, at the last stage of imperialism, and the idea that like debt will become that thing which defines the way markets operate and the way people think about money. But debt itself is not simply a mechanism of finance capitalism. It's a compulsion to work itself. And we know that debt, cash bond, incarceration are all linked via forced labor. So less a question and more of an offering. I will leave my comments there. I have reached exactly 14 minutes, and I will stop and say thank you to all of you.
Wow. So Adele put many, many issues on the table with this story. Many stories, but especially the ones in the 2000 between the Committee of Experts and the Obama administration, it looks like, which you hadn't mentioned, but I found was actually made the story even more worth digging into. And Badur has furthered some of the discussion of racial capitalism, as well as put just some small little issues on the table. And fortunately, we have some time. So I'd like to give Adele the chance to respond for a minute, or up to 5 if you want. And then folks can start thinking about your questions and typing them in.
Well, I'll respond with gratitude. Really very thoughtful comments, and they are making me want to start that sabbatical and actually start writing a bigger project. So what I've presented today is a discrete kind of case study, and you've wonderfully woven it through the literature that undergirds the starting point, right, around why challenge. And I love how you pose at the outset the peculiar double bind posed by the framing around metaphor and the pushback to that. And Neil Roberts refers to, well, it's not just a metaphor, or and there's various attempts, and there's a response, frankly, to Tuck and Yang emerging out of Black studies critiques that actually does entirely the flip, right? And slavery is a metaphor, right? So there's a real grappling with what you name so beautifully, and that is the refusal to allow this history to disappear through the proliferation, the absolute insistence on naming all forms of human suffering via the really non-legal language of exploitation, right? Slavery, right? So an historical experience that of course extends to ancient times, and that someone, I've heard Fred Moten refer to the love-hate relationship with the brilliance of Orlando Patterson, but also the real trap of engaging slavery as social death, right? And the scholarship that has emerged through that, Blackness is nothingness, right? But the refusal to understand the operation of the break that Cedric Robinson, of course, understood predated the emergence of transatlantic slavery and forces Europe to grapple with, right? With its locus in Europe, in racialization of groups that we would now refer to as ethnic communities, right? But his insistence, and I absolutely agree with you on the pivotal nature of that methodology, but insistence on framing that continuity and then enabling a framing of the ongoing character. There's an insistence on ignoring the specificity of racialization and how that changes, must change the way that we understand enslavement, right? So how is it that we come to the early 1900s and new institutions, and the first thing they do is say, we're going to deal with slavery, and then they do it in a way that erases immediately that centuries-long legacy that I persist in underscoring, and I think Greg Grandin's work, interestingly, is the one that does the most in contemporary context to put a fine point on this, that is so pivotal to the way that we understand legal liberalism, right? They erase the racialization and repurpose slavery and forced labor for colonialism. To not only to justify colonialism, but to seek to extend colonialism in places like Libya. So there is so much there that legal scholars have not engaged with. So I come to this as a labor lawyer, an international labor lawyer. So I see this through the lens that has been so much a part of pushing out and away from a constraining vision of the origins of the field and the origins of the international dimensions. And that, of course, that Du Bois tackles, right? and really in such a clear-sighted manner, right? In his framing of, white labor, black labor, and kind of how, one operates the divide, the ability to maintain the color line precisely because they're not seeing interests as laborers, right? They're seeing it as something different. So black labor is something else in that framing. So do I take issue with, the longstanding concerns about characterization? Does the effort to insert this narrative into, and indeed to subvert in the process a narrative of labor law, is that part of the problem rather than part of the solution? And I know you were much gentler in your framing of that, but it becomes part of that discussion. And I think, look, we need to have conversations that extend our historical understanding in ways that disrupt many of our fields. And so doing this work in labor law is part of that productive, or dare I say reproductive work of thinking more broadly and engaging, forcing an engagement with scholars who, lo and behold, actually saw this and forced a reimagining of the relationships that were not seen or that were obscured. So to actually see that the first Director General of the ILO, French socialist Albert Thomas, understood that there was no dichotomy in the way that, contemporary thinkers would like to erect it, right? At that point, is part of this attempt to have a different, deeper discussion about where we're going. And I'm very much looking forward to further exchanges, further conversations about the work that is woven into this discussion, right? And that needs to be part of a discussion of rethinking who was involved. And I have to say, I find this, it's wonderful, at this stage in my trajectory to be finding that this newness of what was not new at all, right, but was obscured, brings just a different breadth of insight into how we can go forward, understanding and reframing this discipline. And so many a Pan-Africanist scholar from the turn of the century is accompanying me into this sabbatical. And your reflections, Dr. Allegra, will and your scholarship will be a part of that ongoing reflection. So thank you so much.
Great. So folks should feel free to turn your cameras on, and the students in particular should turn your cameras on. They do exist, you can see. There's a lot to take in there. Okay, Nathan Simmons.
Hi, just want to first say thank you to both Adele and Vidor for great speeches today, especially again with Adele, Adelle Blackett. That was it was a pleasure to read both papers you had. I guess something that I sort of brought up in my reflection paper that I wondered if it was of any interest, might be just sort of looking at sort of like unionized labor specifically, and sort of like the demographic breakdown on that. What's sort of your take on that issue, I guess?
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for your comment, and I enjoyed reading it, as I did the other two. So you mentioned a number of things, and I'm guessing your research is taking you into that thorny moment in the 1980s and the air pilot strike and the impact that had on weakening labor, right? So it's one thing to say labor as an interlocutor, but there have been, of course, important moments in which labor's been, seemingly checkmated in its ability to respond. And, unionization rates are so low. We're not in the height of the Fordist era and following Great Migration and different kinds of different patterns of representation. So, what can I say other than that? This has a huge impact. I mentioned toward the end of my talk, and I strongly encourage, I think it should be required reading, the look at the AFL-CIO's complaint, right, to the ILO. So one might have thought that U.S. labor might focus itself on the domestic, right, and focus itself on turning measures only to government. And of course, in a moment like this, the importance of seeking to reach out to international actors, and in the process to put a transnational spotlight on what's going on, to name it in clear and precise ways, to do it in an intersectional way, and to take seriously the fact that a freedom of association complaint needs to take into account patterns of racialization, right? Not dichotomize and leave those to other spaces. So this all comes through this complaint. It's really granular. It focuses on particular sectors, as I mentioned in the talk, meat packing, for example, right? It's, meat packing, but also university professors in contexts where they're forced to actually to teach in person. so a really sweeping reminder of the extent to which the ILO fundamental principles and rights at work are increasingly seen not as propaganda tools, right, as some of this paper suggests in relation to, Cold War era politics, but actually as deeply necessary dimensions of the local economy, right? So I think we're at a really particular moment where social movements internally are paying far more attention. You might say this is sheer desperation, but it's also a moment of reckoning and a moment in which the ability of the trade union movement internationally and for a range of progressive actors to pay attention. One of the things, and this is not quite your comment, Nathan, but one of the things that I've been hoping to encourage is greater attention between UN bodies, including CERD and other treaty monitoring bodies, as well as special rapporteur system, to pay closer attention to what's happening at the ILO. In 2019, when the Centenary Declaration was being negotiated, one of the things that happened is that several rapporteurs wrote in and said that occupational safety and health needed to be thought of as a fundamental principle and right at work. And there's been some movement in that direction following that and following the Centenary Declaration. So really important space for movement that unions play an important role in. And the demographic challenges persist, but there are creative dynamic actions underway to make things move.
Next up, we have Marta, who has a question and she'd like to speak.
That was really fascinating. Thank you so much to both of you for your talk and your response. My thoughts on this topic are really scattered, but I'm going to try and pose a question. I was really happy that you ended, Dr. Alaga, you ended by bringing the conversation around to, are enslaved people laborers or are they something else? And then this tension, this back and forth between laborers and commodities, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in my own work, which I wrote about in the paper that we shared with Dr. Blackett. And so one way that I'm thinking about it in my own work is on immigration and immigrant detention. And the way that I've been thinking about it, and I would just love to hear your thoughts about this, is that immigrants almost are more the phenomenon of immigrant detention today is almost like it can tell us maybe something about what's been going on this whole time, because there's no justification for there's no real justification for immigrant detention. There's not even a legal, I don't know what people who study law in the room can tell me. The legal justification for immigrant detention seems to be very shaky. And so, but people are making, there's money to be had off of immigrant detention, but not money to be had off of anything that they are doing or producing. And so I think that might bring into really stark relief this idea that there's something else going on, and it's not just about capturing the surplus of racialized groups as labor. And so I'm still wrapping my head around this, and I'd really be happy to hear about your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really fantastic question. And this is a question that I've gotten as well from students in my class. And each time I answer it, I give a different answer. So let's see which answer I give today. So, part of the problem, so the question, right, I find that changing the question betrays a lot of things, right? So the question of, are enslaved people and enslaved Africans, particularly during the early modern period, workers? Are they laborers, right? I find that the question itself betrays its own insufficiency, because the problem is not necessarily whether or not the category labor or worker is expansive enough to include enslaved Africans. It's just that the experience of enslavement in the Americas in particular, it really exceeds, right, the known vocabulary that we have. So then what do? Do we attempt to cram this excess into this category of worker and labor, which itself is unstable, right? Do we attempt to do that? Or do we attempt to place the concept of the laborer and the worker in constellation, as part of a constellation of thinking, right? And in that way, attempt to not necessarily pin down or render static or fix the laborer in such a way, because we can't, but instead open up other complexities that might arise from perhaps changing the question. And so if we change the question from, are enslaved people workers or laborers? And then if we change the question to something else, like, for example, what does the system of racial slavery tell us, right, about the stability or instability of the category of labor? What does it tell us, right, about the manner in which things like labor, commodity, capital, right, are not discrete formations, but always already unstable, right, and needing to be consistently problematized along not a linear, but an incremental historical schema, right? For example, that's something I'm like, okay, I'm interested in that. That's something that I can get more interested in, right? Less of an attempt, right, to fix enslaved labor inside of a particular schema, but rather to throw the whole schema into crisis and use then enslaved labor as a different point of entry, rather than labor per se, worker per se. And, Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, he undoes the kind of, Hegelian dialectic around recognition via this category of work, which looks different, right, when the enslaved harness it or mobilize it, right? And he says famously, what the master wants from the slave is not recognition, it's work, right? And so, but work means something very different in this kind of conception. So not an answer to your question, but more complexity to offer, right? So perhaps if we look away from labor for a moment, something will come into sharper focus, right? The other thing is that the question of there's also this thing that, like, there are certain things about slavery that just didn't make sense, right? In the way that we think things should make sense. Why would someone brutalize and kill enslaved people when they rely on them to extract surplus value, right? The idea is that it's not nonsensical, right? But there is a register, a logical register that's operating, that's outside of the master script that's offered to us, right? In terms of the way surplus value works, right? But that there is a symbolic surplus value that can be exacted, right, from enacting violence on people, right? So where the material surplus value might not be apparent from killing an enslaved person, there is a symbolic surplus value that's extracted, right? And that is actually not the absence of logic, but it's a logic that exceeds the law itself, right? Which is why it's hard to pin it down in such a way, right? And so this is why it's so important when Sylvia Wynter inverts the base superstructure model, right? That the base is actually the narrative condemnation.
I'm so curious about that. If you can tell us more about that also.
I mean, it's an unpublished book, Black Metamorphosis, but in essence, right, she inverts the base superstructure model and tells us, right, that the ideological assumptions, the narrative condemnation is actually the base, which produces then the superstructure, right? So the idea is that the system does not precede the story that we tell about the system, right? So when we change the way we tell the story about that thing, we also change the way it appears in the world, which is why it's so fascinating, Professor Blackett's insistence, right? That, like, what if we told a different story about what forced labor means inside of this legal context? Is a fascinating one. And so I don't have answers for you. I have more questions, right? More complexity, but it shows the way studying slavery is like trying to catch a cloud and pin it down. It exceeds, right, the grammar available to us. It exceeds the law. It also underpins that same law, which it exceeds, right? So you have to have a kind of heterological approach, right, to studying it. It's the only way, right? And it's more work for you, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it's fascinating work. Just a great answer. What I'll add to that is that the exceeding the logic of the law is a piece that we just haven't started scratching the surface on. We haven't started asking how it is that we created law around notions of freedom without acknowledging the depth of the unfreedom that framed that, right? It didn't happen in abstraction from that. It happened because of the existence of this othered experience that is enslavement that was so central to the framing. And so the periodizing of enslavement, including, frankly, that remarkable period where this logic of violence, where the slave master made the law, right? And we cannot forget this pluralist dimension of lawmaking. That's why the violence was part of the lawmaking, because the slave master was empowered, right, to do that. But you get this fascinating periodization, and Caitlin Rosenthal's work is kind of teasing away at some of that, where the slave trade ends, but slavery is still legal. And then that kind of violence to the death has to take on a different kind of logic, right? There has to be a different kind of thinking around management. And guess what? That's where much of the understanding of Taylorist principles of scientific management in labor emerges out of, right? In that accounting in the plantations. So there is so much we haven't turned attention to in understanding how we have come to create particular categories, including, frankly, the category we call work, out of enslavement. Now, Marta, you started your question and your comment on my paper around immigration and immigration detention centers. And I'm going to take that question to some of the work that is emerging largely outside of the US context, but where we also see this proliferation of the criminalization of migrants, right, for no particular reason. And we see the emergence of labor conditions like prison labor, right? So the logics that emerge out of our understanding of slavery and that are persist through early conscript labor and continue in mass incarceration, those logics get re-articulated, unearthed in immigrant labor detention context. The person who's doing, I think, pivotal work on this is Katie Bales in the UK. So the continuity, the transnationalization, if you will, of structures, legalized structures of unfreedom, follow these patterns, and it's critically important to pay attention to the continuities as well as the disjunctures.
I might just add one thing just that came up that I forgot to say while I was giving my answer, is that two things, right? So if you look at something like the Code Noir, for example, right, and the different way that it was introduced in Louisiana as opposed to Haiti, right, you can see how, for example, in Haiti, right, the introduction of the Code Noir was to prevent abuses, right, of enslaved persons via slave masters. But it was not actually the absence of the law that led to the violence. The very presence of the law increased the violence because it offered a veil for that same violence. right? So anyone, you know, with some sense would say, well, the same person who would beat an enslaved person to death is liable to lie in court about it, right? And say, I didn't do it. But, right, the very presence of the law is what reduced the amount of actual kind of like technical recourse for enslaved persons and increased the amount of violence, right? So we can see how the introduction, this is the thing about liberalism, right? The way it sticks and moves, because at once, right? It is the mechanism via which we are told is like the antidote to violence, but it is the main veil for that same violence and is implicated in replicating that same violence, which leaves, right, enslaved persons inside, again, of this kind of double bind, right? So when you're asking the question of like, how does this make sense, right? You are thrown into disorder by this liberal vortex, right? Which is throwing these different rationales at you from every single direction in order to uphold what? The compulsion to work, right? And it will use whatever discursive gymnastics it has to, right, in order to do that. That's why liberalism looks like anything. It looks like conservatism. It looks like radicalism. It looks like literally anything. It is a scavenger ideology. It will do whatever it must, right, to uphold the compulsion to work. So.
Before I call on the next person, there's a question coming in from the YouTube about whether the paper is available publicly. And so I don't know if Adele, you could just quickly say when, I know you said it's forthcoming in the UCLA Law Review, whether you have a date. I think we can probably, if you remind us, send it around to people who registered when it's available.
Sure, yeah. So the paper is forthcoming with the UCLA Law Review. I think like many with COVID-19, authors like myself have slowed them down. So hopefully it'll be sometime this fall, if not early spring, I'm sure. It's part of a special issue and linked to some pivotal work that Tendai Achiume and Slabali have been doing through the Promise Center there on fostering conversations on race, CRT, TWAIL, and international law. So when my paper comes out, there'll be a slew of other really fascinating papers coming through. And the Dalhousie Law Journal paper, which some of the class participants read, should be out very soon. So I'll be happy to send that along. Once it comes, it focuses a little more on the racial capitalism literature and some of the archival materials in the ILO, but it's a bit quirky and has some references also to a novel, Essie Adukian's Washington Black, and her refusal also to dichotomize slavery and so-called freedom.
Great. And actually, my colleague, Michelle Dickerson, wrote me privately, but that she found the complaint and is probably going to use it in a class in COVID. So I'm going to move that to the chat, Michelle, if that's okay. Thank you for doing that. Kirsten Kumar.
I'd just like to echo thanks to the both of you first. Again, that was really fascinating, and it's a lot to digest, and there seems to be a lot of kind of players that are currently on the table as potentially being involved in these conversations and moving forward. Dr. Blackett, I know you mentioned the need to kind of have this conversation to extend our historical understandings across a number of industries. So I'm curious to know, just from the both of you, who you view to be kind of the integral actors that need to take part in these conversations. Obviously, the ILO and international labor law put at least some level of onus on states, but how much of different private actors are also involved and need to be involved in these conversations, and what would kind of a positive obligation like that to move forward and to have a more integrated approach look like in your ideal view?
And this is related to her paper too.
Well, your papers sound fascinating. Thanks for a great question, Christian Kumar. Your comment actually reminds me to cycle back also to something that Professor Allegra mentioned about the multiple sites of entry if you're thinking beyond particular categories, if you're asking a different set of questions. And something, frankly, coming back to Marto, I assure you, that is true when you're just thinking about what workers or people themselves bring when they ask us to be concerned about them, right? Their humanity. And so immigrant workers might say, you know, you want to focus on my collective bargaining rights, and that's super important, but I want status, right? If you right. And there's, so this is not, it's not a question that is fixed externally to the focus on work and labor, but is part of any effort to decenter a framing that posits as its field and as its prototype. You know, and there we go, the able-bodied white male from the Western North in, you know, particular historical context, right? It's just about restarting in many ways. And so who are the interlocutors then, if you're thinking differently about how you understand these interrogations? And your frame becomes much broader. The ILO was built as tripartite. It had quite a fixed, again, very central Western European vision of who the interlocutors would be. They would be government. So it's not a traditional interstate institution in that it's got through its entire constitutional structure, governments, workers' representatives, and employers' representatives as part of the governing structure, right? And decisions are all taken with them. But that's a very Fordist, very Western European vision of who is relevant in the world of work. And part of the work here is to say, we need to be thinking about constituencies in a more composite sense. And every work of reframing who matters and what experiences matter, what histories matter, become an interrogation of who should be considered. So certainly not just states, certainly a range of social movements, a range of organizations and communities as they are defined. One of the most moving kind of archival moments for me was to see the hand signed, sometimes, X's next to a name that Marcus Garvey brought forward as part of his United Negro Improvement Association framing of the representation of the Black world in as stakeholders in relation to what was being done around so-called native labor, around so-called colored labor, around slavery, right? So a much broadened vision. Of course, it won't surprise you to hear me say that this vision has to be transnational as well. Must include thinking about groups as they spatially constitute themselves. And sometimes that seems really abstract. But I have to say, watching movements of domestic workers. So try to find a more isolated category of workers, right? Alone in individual households, spatially constrained, the history written into their very bodies of the enslavement and subordination and servitude. And these primarily women have formed an international union federation that meets regularly, that takes the public space constantly, that is deeply involved in establishing international labor law through Convention 189, but also on just keeping things moving, especially now in the midst of COVID-19, right? They're part of the interlocutors. They've known how to use the transnational space. So I'm thinking very broadly. I'm thinking about international organizations. I'm thinking of supervisory bodies within them and the various networks of international human rights clinicians and litigators in various parts of the world who are moving the needle on many of these issues. So it's crucial, I think, to think beyond states, beyond the national, and beyond the usual suspects, right? This is much more fluid form of unsettling of understandings of our field and movement.
I'll try to offer a bit of a non-answer to your question. I think it's so difficult, to talk about, who needs to be involved in these kinds of discussions because, so one thing that becomes, apparent when you study slavery, when you study labor movements, when you study anything, right, is that usually the first kind of group or first kind of interlocutor that's engaged as the primary site of contestation is the state. And then we begin to realize that when we actually study people's histories and radical movements, that the state is usually the biggest obstacle, right, to progress. And that in fact, that the state itself has to be exceeded and destabilized in order for the actual experiences of people to be adequately circulated. And the truth is that people are already circulating in these movements and ways that go against and exceed the state and actually delegitimize the state. Yet for some reason, when things like this happen, the state is the first thing called upon, when we know that it's becoming more and more apparent that the state is the least appropriate container available to describe this thing we call human association, political life, right? So there's a bit of a contradiction that's embedded there. And then part of the difficulty for me is, that slavery is the bedrock of the whole world. I mean, it is what it holds up the sky, right? And so then when we say who to involve, the question is, like, who have we let off the hook, right? Because everybody is involved. And slavery is not only the bedrock of our whole world system, right? But that bedrock's durability relies on our ability to disavow it, even in its necessity for us to make ourselves coherent as political, social actors, right? So then the question is less who needs to be there than who has been left off the hook because we are all implicated, right? And that is what's so important about Cedric Robinson's understanding of racial capitalism, right? Because Cedric Robinson was actually intervening in the literature of world systems theory, right? Because his argument is that there is a world system of the periphery and core, the industrial and the primitive accumulatory, right? He's saying that there is another world system, right? That is more essential than that. That world system is racial capitalism, right? And so racial capitalism not being simply wherever race meets class, you have racial capitalism, but a distinct historical process, right? Which carries forward the already embedded modes of difference, right? What if we understood that to be the transnational system? What if that were the world system we were engaging and not something else? Well, how would our questions change about who needs to be present? How would the question change as to who are the absented presences, right? Or would we let off the hook? Because slavery is truly that thing that holds up the whole sky, right? And if one part of that moves, the whole thing comes tumbling down, which is why the disavowal is so important. So, I mean, it's not really an answer, but more complication.
So I'm going to actually combine two of the questions that we have. One of them is from Anne Lewis, and the other one is from someone on our YouTube chat. So they're kind of connected. I'll start with Anne's question, which is really about unions. And she asks, do you think that the union is the only agency that compelled workers, as in the sort of alternative title to forced workers, have in Texas, or are there other forces? That's one question, and it's kind of related to the question that we have about could we go beyond criticism and offer solutions? How would you continue an economy that needs certain workers through a pandemic, and what would you do different? So I guess the question is, where does unions fit into that policy solution, or that list of policy solutions?
I think my answer will be much shorter, so maybe I'll go first. I think in terms of where unions fit in, I mean, unions have a complicated history as far as Black people are concerned. We know, right, that the manner in which unions have been important and formative, right, in this country and elsewhere, but also the manner in which they've been used to territorialize the color line, so to speak, and reify it along the lines of labor. And we know that, as Du Bois, tells us in Black Reconstruction, right, that the development of white unions and white labor is tied up in the betrayal of Black labor and the death of the promise of radical or abolition democracy in this country. And we certainly can't let kind of mainstream unions off the hook for that type of betrayal. But also, Black people have different radical union histories in this country. And if you look to the work of someone, for example, like Clyde Woods, who talks about the different kinds of union movements that emerged in the Greenbelt and the Mississippi Delta. Robin Kelly talks about the kind of radical red internationalist Black unions that emerge in Alabama in his book Hammer and Hoe, right? So Black people have very distinct relationships to unions that are, again, they kind of ebb and flow, part of, but also not quite part of. And also Black people have had their autonomous union spaces for quite some time. So the question is not necessarily what can unions do, but rather what forms of association can we come up with, right? That stretch union forms of association, or even go beyond unionized union in the strictest sense forms of association. Maybe, after this long 100 years, this long century, we might be able to think about other modes of association politically and socially and economically, right? That can do the work that I think unions have had about 100 years to get the thing right around working class kind of solidarity and coalition building. And perhaps there's a different way we can think about it while including unions, right? Unions are still important. So again, a non-answer.
So thanks for the questions. I wanted to get my head around the first question in particular around unions in Texas, and what I'm understanding of the comment is that despite unionization, you've got a lot of compulsion faced by workers in this context. And so what I read of that is that turning to the ILO is seen as a sensible response in the context, right? It's another space for raising some very serious concerns around the generalized lack of meaningful social protection for workers in the context, and that affects their very ability to protect their safety, right? Just really basic concerns. And so the interrogation about what it means to be denied the freedom of association is being situated on a different plane. And in line with a set of understandings about what it means to be able to exercise the freedom of association, collective bargaining rights, and what it means to be free from forced labor in a way that starts from the particularity of the experience, including the racialization of the experience, and puts it again into dialogue with international labor standards in a way that's not so familiar. So I think there's a really important opening there. But there's no level of surprise here. What you're dealing with is generalized failures to address the humanity of a significant portion of the US population. And no surprise that the overlap with or historical links to enslavement are so strong, because they're not in the past, right? The point, right? They're continuing, they're ongoing, and the structures have not been designed to safeguard those workers at all. So is there a need to break out, to think more broadly? Am I encouraged by this move? Yes, right. But am I, expecting that this is going to kind of lead to any truly significant change, short of a fundamental internal rethink? No, right. And so that leads me to the second question, as it was framed around, what do we do in the middle of a crisis? And isn't that the problem, right? Isn't that, what do you do in the work of settler colonialism, right? Well, you need slaves. And if that's the question, if the starting point is the needs of the majority population, well, frankly, it wasn't even the majority, right? For most, right? If the starting frame is not the humanity of the people doing the work, then we're not having the same conversation. And I'm putting it absolutely starkly, because this is how we come back to compulsion as part and parcel of how we move particular understandings of work forward, right? And at the heart of so much of what we debate in labor law, right? Subordination is central to the definition of employee status. There's so much underexplored work that is required if you actually force yourself to sit with the concepts, even as they're received, right? And think about what they've enabled. And that's why so much of my work has also just, stayed with the fault lines between, enslavement, indenture, coexistence of both wage labor and compulsion in the same person at the same time, right? Because those categories, of course, need to be imploded, but they tell us something about the fundamental insistence on, as Professor Allegra has insisted, the compulsion to work. Right? So we need to have and insist on different kinds of conversations. If our conversation is leading us to, how do you take care of me? Then we haven't shifted, right? There has to be a conversation that starts more like we, right? And of course, we know the depth of the schism in our societies makes even that starting point so deeply fraught. So forgive me for insisting very starkly on that, but I just don't think we're going to move past unless that starting point is deeply understood and frankly felt.
So Michelle Dickerson has a question. Michelle Khan has a question, and then if there's time, and I'll throw one in. So, Michelle.
So I loved both of your papers, and two comments or comments and papers. A comment that Professor Allegra made and a statement that Professor Blackett made a couple of minutes ago sort of have been sticking with me. And that's sort of the notion of private prison labor. I write about debt, specifically mostly middle class debt, but now increasingly all types of debt. And Professor Blackett said the slave trade ends, but slavery continues. And what that made me think of is debtors' prisons are abolished, and yet they continue to exist. And so the thing, one of the sort of part of what I'll be teaching and have taught and that I write about are these fees and fines. And the fact that they're disproportionately affecting Black and brown people. So you get a traffic ticket, and then the traffic ticket you don't pay, and then you get the fine on top of that, and you don't pay, and then there's a warrant for your arrest. And then if you're stopped by the police and you're a Black male and you flee, you could end up dead. And so my question to you is sort of, how should we think of the best way to, fix that? Do we look at it from the people that are profiting from the labor that are in private prisons, criminal justice, maybe fix it on that end, or just sort of looking at it from a labor perspective generally, if we think that people are disproportionately being thrown in private prisons so that the people that own stock in those prisons can have a larger portfolio.
Right. Michelle?
Oh, I'm going to ask my question? Sure.
Yeah, let's just get them out.
Sure. Thank you so much for this. This was just so helpful, and I had so many aha moments as I was listening to both of the talk and the response as well. My question is actually coming from my own work, which is on Indian slavery and the abolition and the aftermath of not slavery, but actually the aftermath of abolition in India. And the question that I have is really going back to Vidur's initial comment about, this kind of bifurcation that exists between labor and slavery and how we get stuck between these two different categories. And I'm wondering about how thinking about the Indian labor in particular could help us think through and even further problematize that. So in my work, I'm coming up against the same problem, where in India, the sort of ontological reality of slavery was denied by the law. So whatever kind of labor conditions were encountered by first the colonial presence, but then also later in this sort of like ILO moment, was that nothing could be called slavery, but then also nothing could be called labor. So you have this problem where the sort of third category of things, going back to Vidur's point of what do you call it, this third category of things comes to define the overwhelming reality of laboring relationships in that part of the world. So this sort of residual category then turns into what we now call informal labor and the sort of problems of that. But in this initial moment, you have an entire people that are caught up in these very hegemonic debates happening between slavery and labor and left out. So I thought that maybe that's one way that you can position the really important role that India sort of plays in sort of teasing out this very particular kind of problem at the ILO. And just to sort of echo the point that Professor Blackett made about how slavery and indenture can be lived in the same moment in the same person, I think the Indian labor also represents that quite powerfully. So it's a question about widening that frame, and it's also a question about, is there a role for this in this conversation? Yeah. Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Okay, so we have 1 minute, and on the theory that we can talk to Badur anytime in this world in which really you're just as close to us as she is. But she has agreed to let you answer in 1 minute, both of those questions. And then you get to escape mine, except maybe I'll just say, if I'd asked one, I would have wanted to hear more about what's like, get you to say more of the nitty gritty of what's wrong with the focus on forced modern slavery as it, I mean, you hint at it, but I wanted to hear more, but you don't have to do it. So just if you can answer the Michelle and Michelle.
So thank you. Great comments and questions. And really, there's no answering them other than to say, I'm really looking forward to the work that you're both doing, Michelle and Michelle, on related themes. And the work on debt, middle class debt, just strikes me as absolutely right, and actually comes back to a point Michelle made earlier as well, via Lenin around thinking through debt. And there's some interesting contemporary work on debt and the morality of it as well, and the compulsion that flows through the assumptions about, or the guilt about, debt and being able to have particular lifestyles. So absolutely critical, and critical to, I think, insist on interpreting this through the lens of what we allow when we read the 13th Amendment broadly. And so there's important historical work, including Rebecca Zitlow's work on what the 13th Amendment was meant to look like if you were looking at it from a positive labor vision, right? And challenging the very restrictive vision that is currently moved forward. But I think that frames as well the importance attached to, by some of the early Reconstruction era thinkers, to how a positive framework or understanding of labor and labor rights was meant to be responsive. And so, Michelle, of course, your research, which I'm very much looking forward to learning more about, holds us to a place that says there's more here. And we know that too when we think about the way that emancipation, so to speak, was dealt with in the Caribbean, right? And the multiplication of the categories that enabled precisely this space that, of course, was not a space of freedom, to be retained and proliferated and extended. And this takes us into the more contemporary work on the plantation economy, right? That surrounds the literature in the Caribbean context, and I'm thinking in particular of Beckford's work at this time. So there's so, how to end on, other than to say that there is so much work that needs to be done, and that needs to be done with a broader, indeed different set of starting questions, right? And we've had a lovely taste of that. And so if Professor Allegra has given me the minute that I've taken now too, I think, let me throw it back to say that the kind of opening you're doing is absolutely pivotal. And it's lovely to be able to have these conversations in a deeply interdisciplinary way. So much of what I've been trying to do is to bring some of this work that is so rich to the attention of those who have constrained our field to, who is an employee? Like, no, not now. It's just too weighty to still be having those conversations. And we need to take serious looks both at what we've known for a long time through the histories, and what we need to discover anew, if you will, as we try to imagine our futures.
Well, you all have been remarkable and remarkably long-standing. So I actually, I was going to say this at the beginning, so I'll just say now that last year we really started a lot of our discussion around racial capitalism with a conference on prison abolition. And so I really loved that this paper and topic brought together so many of the issues that we were discussing there. We were also trying to put the discussion around prisons in the United States, or around prison abolition, in conversation with people who were working in the context of immigration detention. And that was a very fruitful discussion. So you all managed to continue that too, which is really great. And you know, so now our project is the future of, we'll let Badur tell us if we can call it, maybe not labor, but work. Anyway, I really am extremely grateful to both of you. And Adele, thank you for traveling so far. And hopefully we'll be able to keep you in the conversation. So everyone join me in thanking Professors Blackett and Alagra. And I know our conversation will continue with or without you, but hopefully with you. So take care.